Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Meanings of Mobility, Family, Undocumented Immigration, and the Rise of the New Latino Elite. Leah Schmalzbauer, professor of American Studies and Sociology, has taught at Amherst College since 2014. Professor Schmalzbauer received her bachelor's degree from the University of New Hampshire, her master's degree from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and her doctorate from Boston College. She is an ethnographer interested in how contemporary global capitalism affects the movement of people across international borders as well as within nation states. Professor Schmalzbauer is especially interested in how the institution of the family influences and is influenced by immigration. Please join me in welcoming Professor Schmalzbauer.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Welcome back to Amherst. You have a beautiful weekend, so it's really nice to be a part of the celebration. I want to start by saying I'm supposed to be standing up here with my student, Leah Andres. She cannot be here, obviously. She's not here. She graduated in December, writing a beautiful Summa thesis, and she got a job about 10 days before graduation, and last week her boss said, okay, commencement or reunion, and we decided commencement was where she should go, so she's not here, but she's very much here in spirit, and she helped me think through and prepare what I'm going to talk about, although I decided to change a bit of what I'm talking about and focus more on my data, although I will bring in a bit of hers as well. So today I'm going to share a segment of a new book project, and this is the first time that I've talked about this project publicly. It's a life history study of low-income Latino students at Amherst College. Specifically, it's a study of their mobility paths and their experiences of that social mobility to Amherst College. I began thinking about this project soon after arriving to Amherst in 2014. I was really inspired by the many Latino students that I was getting to know in my immigration classes and my immigration seminars. And I was inspired in large part because their academic success, the academic success of the students I was getting to know is not represented in the sociology of immigration literature. This is a literature that tends to focus much more on the barriers and paints a pretty dire picture of the prospects for low-income Latino youth in the United States. On the other hand, it also became clear to me after arriving at Amherst that much of the admission material, both here at Amherst but also at other elite colleges and universities, while rightfully celebratory of the diversity of the student body, the shifting demographics, was also painting a pretty simplistic picture. So whereas my students were thriving academically, in my office hours I was hearing different stories. A parent deported, financial challenges at home, staying up late at night to translate documents, tax forms for parents, and the challenges of navigating two radically different worlds. So the inspiration for this book project came from those conversations that were happening in class, but also outside of class. So the questions that I'm thinking about in this project are the following. I'm interested in what the paths to Amherst look like for low-income Latino youth. I'm interested in the challenges and opportunities that are embedded in these paths, in this exceptional mobility that we're seeing. And I'm interested in how these challenges and opportunities are shaping students' aspirations and indeed their plans for the future post-Amherst. And I'm also really interested in how family and immigration play into this story. So I want to say a bit about the context of low-income students at elite colleges and universities, just to give us some basic sociological background on this story. The social mobility of low-income Latinos at Amherst is indeed an exceptional mobility. It's rare for low-income students to get to elite schools. It's even rarer for low-income Latinos to arrive at schools like Amherst. So a few statistics from sociologist Sarah Goldrick-Rab, who's at Temple University. She finds that 74% of ninth graders across race, class, and ethnicity aspire to attend college when they're surveyed. But only 51% of low-income students will ever attend any sort of college, including community college. And only 2 out of 5 low-income students will ever receive any kind of a degree, including an associate's degree. The statistics are worse for Latino youth, who have the lowest college completion rates of any ethnic minority in the United States at 21%. And the 21% completion rate includes Latinos from all income backgrounds. So we know that higher income Latinos are much more likely to complete college. Low-income youth, Latino youth, have very, very low chances statistically of completing college. And undocumented youth and the children of undocumented parents have even less chance in terms of the statistical probabilities of attending college at all. And yet, what really fascinated me when I got to Amherst, and one of the reasons I came here, is because while the general statistics, when the general story of Latino mobility is a dire story, endowment-funded diversity initiatives are radically changing the demographics of our top colleges and universities in the United States. So several of the top colleges and universities now have more racially and socioeconomically diverse student bodies than the US as a whole. So we see these, growing inequality on the general level, and yet a diversification of the very top echelon of the educational sphere. And Amherst is a very important part of the story. And of course, need-blind admissions is part of this. So Amherst is one of 12 US institutions of higher education that provides need-blind aid to all domestic and international students selected for admissions. And Amherst is one of a few colleges and universities that extends this need-blind policy to undocumented students and those students who have deferred action for childhood arrivals, or DACA, which you might be familiar with, as it's a very timely political discussion happening right now. So the aim of this study is to really understand how students are getting to Amherst and what that experience has been like. So the conversation I'm joining is a growing conversation. Actually, 2 of our own, Tony Jack, who's now a sociologist at Harvard, Buffy Aries, who's a psychologist here, have written quite a bit on the experiences of low-income students at elite schools. And what I'm bringing to the conversation is how immigration and immigrant families weave into this story. So my original plan for today is that I would talk from the early analysis of my first round of data about the paths that low-income Latinos are traveling to get to Amherst. And I would identify some of the key factors that have shaped their exceptional mobility. And then Alali was going to speak from her senior thesis, focusing on the complex challenges that accompany undocumented students and those students who have undocumented parents. Since Alali can't be here today, I'm going to focus most of the talk on the pathways to Amherst, but I'm going to try to bring in some of the experiential piece at the end, and I want to save time for questions and comments and discussion as well. Okay, so a few pieces of information about where I'm getting the information I'm going to share with you. This is a life history project, and thus far I've done 50 life history interviews with low-income Latinos who are at Amherst or who have recently graduated. The interviews were all done while they were still students. And I've also, I just got funding to extend the study to 20 more life history interviews and to include 10 case studies of siblings of students who are at Amherst. It's very common that the students who are at Amherst may have a sibling who doesn't go to college at all or who's in community college. I'm really interested in this inequality within families as well. And then Alali did 6 life history interviews for her senior thesis. So some of this will come from those as well. All of Alali's participants were the children of undocumented parents. And in my participant pool, 6 have DACA, and over half are members of a mixed legal status family. So that gives you an idea of the number of U.S. citizen children in the U.S. who have at least one person in their close family member who doesn't have legal status. And they're from all different ethnic backgrounds, but all Latino. Okay, a few words on just what we know from the sociology literature about immigration and prospects for what we call second-generation youth, the children of immigrants. Okay, so what we know from the sociology literature in terms of mobility and mobility prospects is that immigrants from groups who receive a warm political welcome in the United States, a warm political reception, tend to have higher rates of mobility than groups who do not receive a warm political welcome. So a good example would be Cubans in the US have had pretty high rates of mobility. Mexicans and Haitians have not. Central Americans right now would be an example of a negative reception. We also know that immigrants who come to the United States with high levels of education from their home country tend to do better. In immigrants, good examples, Koreans, Indians, Chinese, they do better than those who arrive with low levels of education. Again, Mexicans, Central Americans tend to arrive with lower levels of education. And this tends to be passed on to their children, this educational privilege and the human capital that comes with that. We also know that historically, immigrant mobility in the United States has tended to map onto incorporation into a white middle or upper class. And when immigrants incorporate into a socially marginalized community or neighborhood, there is a quite good chance of downward mobility. So historically, it was assumed that incorporation equated with mobility. It was a European story. And once you had spent a certain amount of generations in the US, you would do better. Not the case anymore. We also know that having an undocumented legal status or being part of an undocumented family gives further challenges to young people who are trying to incorporate into the United States. So what is really fascinating about the group we're looking at here at Amherst College is they don't fit neatly into this story or into this literature. Their mobility has not been dependent on incorporating into a white middle class or a white upper class. Instead, I'm finding, and I'll speak a bit more about this later on, that most lived very segregated childhoods. Not unusual for Latino students to arrive at Amherst not having known any white people except maybe a teacher or a counselor. We also know that their education mobility is happening despite having grown up in socially marginalized communities. Most have parents with low levels of education. Indeed, everyone in this study is the first in their family to go to college. And they come from immigrant groups that have received a negative reception. Many Mexicans, Central Americans, Dominicans in this study. And they have grown up with lives characterized by that negative political reception, fear of a deportation, and the challenges of being stigmatized as an immigrant in the United States. And additionally, several have had to live apart from parents for much of their childhoods due to visa challenges. So all of this should suggest stunted mobility prospects. And yet, this is not the case. This is not what we're finding with students who are at Amherst, at Harvard, Princeton, other top universities. So why are they different? This is what I want to talk about today, what I'm finding. What distinguishes their incorporation paths from the majority of Latino youth who are not getting to college at all? So often when people inquire about my research, and I tell them what I'm looking at, and I explain that I'm studying the mobility experiences of low-income youth, and those who've gotten to elite schools, their immediate response is, well, they must just have worked really hard and been really dedicated. And I always reply with a bracketed yes. I mean, of course, all of our students have gotten here because they've worked incredibly hard. And it's been a very challenging road to get into Amherst College. And yet, there are many diligent, hardworking, low-income youth who don't end up in college at all and do not end up at Amherst. So again, why is it that some are making it and some are not? So I wanted to bring in a sociological analysis, but to say, of course, resilience and hard work is very much a part of the story, but it's just not the whole story. So the first thing that I find in my research is that place matters a lot. Where you grow up matters a lot. The vast majority of my research participants grew up in or in close proximity to a progressive global city. New York, Chicago, LA, Washington, DC, Miami. And these are global metro hubs who have a long history of welcoming non-European immigrants. And since the civil rights era, they have had programs in place to support low-income minority youth who show academic promise. So many of the students who I've interviewed have attended magnet schools or charter schools that target high-achieving, low-income youth of color. And they are all programs that have emphasized college as an endpoint since their very early school years. So I'm going to share a few quotes as I go along the way. This is a quote. All names and identifying information has changed, by the way. This is from Jaime, who is a Dominican American who grew up in Washington Heights in New York City. And this is what he had to say. He said, "My identity as a student, actually, it's not as a student. My identity is more as a scholar. And it came from my charter school that I started attending in middle school. They called us scholars, not students. And they would take us on college campus visits. I saw Amherst for the first time at the end of my 6th grade year. And so I had college in the back of my mind for years. Very early on, I had an idea of college." And something else that Jaime told me is that he grew up thinking that his graduation year was not his high school graduation year, but his college graduation year. So he was always a 2017, even though he graduated from college and from high school in 2013. The other thing I'm finding is that students have attended public schools with very strong AP programs, and often these are AP programs in public schools that exist in actually a different part of the school. So there's actually a separation of high-achieving students from those who aren't. And another important finding is the publicly or privately funded summer programs that often, again, start in middle school and are enrichment programs and are also networking programs to give students more familiarity with colleges and universities around the country. Examples, Prep for Prep in New York City, the Chicago Scholars Program, the LA Summer Science Program. These are all programs that have come up when students talk about their path to Amherst. An important note, this didn't come up in the intro, but I moved here from Bozeman, Montana. And I had been immersed in immigration research there, doing ethnographic work for 10 years as a professor at Montana State University. And none of my students, I had a peer program going on between MSU and Mexican American youth in the community, had ever thought of leaving Montana for school. Amherst was not on their radar screen, even for the very good students. And I think it's important to note that where immigrant populations are growing fastest in the United States, it's not New York, it's not Miami, it's places like Idaho and Kansas and Nebraska. And these are not places where these programs are in place. So there's potential that is being missed in terms of where support is being offered. I think it's important to think about that. Okay. Another thing that I found in the research is the importance of institutionalized mentors and supports. The global cities where most of my participants grew up and attended school, have schools with strong histories of bilingual staff and bilingual teachers. And they also attended schools that had strong welcoming programs for Spanish-speaking parents and also for undocumented parents. So school was a safe place, very different than what I found in Montana, where it was very rare that you had anyone who could speak Spanish in a school. And no ELL programs, by the way. So each participant noted at least one teacher or a mentor or a counselor or administrator that gave them special help, gave them encouragement, gave them support. And it's important, I think, to remember that the support went a lot further because it was situated in a context of broader support. So they were in schools that had programs that teachers could guide students into that would support them on their path to college. So a couple quotes from students about the important role of mentors and special helpers on their paths. This is from Eduardo, who has DACA, and he's a Central American immigrant who came to the US when he was 12. He's a community college transfer to Amherst College. And he explained to me how he first started thinking about transferring to an elite school. So Eduardo said, one day I saw a flyer that said, if you need any help, if you want to know more information about transferring to a top liberal arts college, and he said the poster listed Amherst College, go see this person. And so I went directly to see that person, and she helped me a lot. She became my advisor. She helped me pick which classes would be better, which classes would be most challenging. She advised me to take more courses and to do extracurriculars. She helped encourage me to join the Student Senate, all of that. And she helped me with my schedule. She knew which courses would be more appealing on my transfer application. And she knew which schools would give financial aid for DACA students. And from Alicia, who grew up in Chicago, the child of undocumented Mexican migrants, she said, Chicago scholars gave me different mentors for different parts of my college application process. So I had someone who was helping me choose colleges, someone who was helping me write my essays, was helping me edit them, and someone who was helping me prepare for the interviews. And she said it was also through Chicago scholars that she learned the difference between a research university and a liberal arts school and helped her think where she would fit best. A third theme that has come up in my interviews is the theme of what we call in sociology the immigrant bargain. The immigrant bargain is the idea that immigrant parents sacrifice a lot to come to the US, and this sacrifice tends to be for their children, to give their children the opportunities that they didn't have. So their part of the bargain is they sacrifice, they will work very hard, and their children's part of the bargain is to do really well in school and to pay back that bargain through success. So this narrative of the immigrant bargain has come up in most of my interviews. And it's come up both as a motivator, but also as a stressor. I mean, you can imagine the pressure that students can feel as well, trying to carry out their part of the bargain. So this is from Isabel, who grew up in LA. She's a part of a large Mexican family. She's the first in her entire extended family to go to college. And she said, my parents were like, you're going to college. I guess I had no choice. I feel like it became my goal before I even started elementary school. It was like, go to college. And I would say, okay, Dad, I don't know what that is, but I will go. But during middle school, it became my goal. My goal was to do really well. I started pushing myself and trying to go further. My main motivator has always been my parents. And then she went on, in school, you have to aprovechar, take advantage of, because school here is free. In Mexico, it's not. In Mexico, you have to buy the supplies and stuff. But in Mexico, you pay for everything. When I started middle school and the books were free too, my parents said, te dan los libros por gratis, mira este libro. And she just showed like holding up this big book. And she said they were always pointing out that school was free for me and I better take advantage of it and make the most of it because they didn't have those opportunities. And Antonio, who is also a DACA student, came to the US from Colombia when he was in elementary school. He said, since I was a kid, I just knew I would go to college. The message was always that my parents had sacrificed a lot for me. My mom left a country that she really loved to give me the opportunity that she never had. And Marta, who just graduated last weekend, told me, graduation will be all about my parents. They are why I'm here. So another notable thing I found about the immigrant bargain, and this really surprised me, is that the vast majority of my research participants did not have jobs during high school. And they came of age in very low income families, but it was a commitment from their parents that their job was to go to school. And so they tend to have jobs at Amherst, and their idea is that they will pay back that commitment when they get good jobs after school. Okay, finally, this is something I found that I just find fascinating and interesting. It's kind of a strategic ploy that students have talked about in their interviews, and it's the importance of knowing how to code switch to do well and to experience mobility. The students I've talked to tell me that they learned sometimes in high school, definitely by the end of their first semester at Amherst, that moving up means you have to employ a certain script. And they talk about the certain ways that you have to talk, the certain ways that you have to learn how to dress, and the certain things that you have to know how to talk about, right? This is cultural capital that is so important, we know, in terms of doing well, moving up, doing well in that interview, showing that you belong in the elite sphere. And they learn that they have to take on different personas than they do at home. Now, they talk about this critically, right? I mean, this can be a violent process to feel like you have to act a certain way, but you would be surprised how many students say, you have to learn the Amherst voice. You may remember this voice, like how you talk when you're in class and you want to impress Professor Sarah, right? Like there's a certain way you talk. And it's not the way many students talked growing up. And they talk about having to learn to make that change. Here's another example. Christian, a Dominican from the Bronx, transferred to Amherst College his junior year from community college in New York City. And Christian talked about how he tried to learn about the elite world in order to make the move. So here's Christian in his own words. One thing that I have learned is that it's not about what you know, it's really about who you know and how you capitalize on that. My community college was right in the heart of the downtown district of New York. So I was a block away from Wall Street. I was surrounded by all these guys walking around with the nice shoes and brand new phones, and I thought to myself, what in the world are they doing that they can afford a $5 coffee? That must be something very important. Sometimes I would just buy the $5 coffee to sit there and I would listen to everything they were saying, just so I could learn about that world. I heard them mention an organization and I look it up online and I join that organization. The elitist world is closed in. It's very secretive, just like it is here at Amherst. But I was able to join this club, and I learned that people in this club have connections. I networked like a madman. I would start going to events online and showing up in New York City, and I would talk to people, and I would kiss up to people. You know, you gotta fake it till you make it. And I would talk to people about stuff that I completely didn't know or care about. So get this. So I studied kayaking. And I said, I'd show up and I would say, yeah, kayaking's great. And I got myself an internship and I transferred to Amherst. So Catalina, who is a Colombian from New York, talked about learning this strategy while she was at Amherst. And she had her eyes set on a financial internship. And Carolina told me, I had no interest in sports, but I joined the crew team because I knew that wouldn't be read as poor Latina. I thought if I could talk about crew, I would do better in my Morgan Stanley interview. And there were other examples about getting the boat shoes and knowing that that would be a marker of belonging, and getting the right Canadian Goose jacket, and just these markers of fitting in. But there were also a few students who said, I won't play that game. I'm not going to play that game. And they also said that they suffered for their refusal. So this is it's definitely a troubling theme that comes up in the research. So Fernanda, who's an indigenous Mexican from the Bronx, both her parents are undocumented, and she said, not everyone can get away with code switching. If you're dark-skinned, definitely if you're indigenous, it's more difficult to play the game. And then she said, Leah, have you ever noticed that most of the Latinos at Amherst College are light-skinned? And that really has struck me. And it's something that has come up with other students as well. Okay, I want to say just a few words of conclusion, and then I'd like to just open it up if people have questions or comments, and maybe we can have some discussion. I think I would start by saying what really, I think, interests me about this in a general sociological sense is the dueling realities of growing class inequality in the United States and a growing hostility politically towards immigration, at the same time that we're seeing this diversification of our top educational institutions and an embrace of low-income students and DACA and immigrant students at Amherst, but also at other schools. So you have a diversification of the elite at the same time that you have this polarization in society in general. And I'm very interested in how this is experienced in the context of families and communities. So what is it like for a student to be rising into this upper echelon, but to have two siblings who won't leave the Bronx? How do you navigate these new inequalities that are developing? You know, whereas public school used to be the mobility platform, what we're seeing now is, yes, in general, going to a SUNY school or a California school may provide a platform for more people. Those who are really springboarding are going to elite private schools, and there aren't many of them. So we're seeing this competing contradiction of growing inequalities within communities and within families, but also a diversification at the top. The other thing I think is important, the other things I think are important to look at include the fact that we still tend to think of mobility as being contingent on incorporation into the white mainstream. And that's not what we're finding. We're finding that students who have done the best have actually been surrounded by other low-income students of color and supported on their way up in this context. And I think in part this is really encouraging because it shows that white and middle class are not the only indicators of success or of mobility, and yet I'm continually struck, both in my teaching experience and my research, about how segregated our lives continue to be. And when Latino students come here and say, this is the whitest place I've ever been, and as a white woman who grew up in Minnesota, I say, this is the most diverse brown place I've ever been. And we have such different reads. And then we wonder why it's so hard to build those bridges. It's something that we're working on really hard at Amherst, but it's a struggle. And the youth who tend to have the easiest incorporation into Amherst tend to be the youth that were tracked into prep schools on scholarship. So a student of mine who became a research assistant told me that he went to Hotchkiss through Prep for Prep, and he said, I landed on Mars in 9th grade. So by the time I got to Amherst, I could deal with Amherst. But students who come out of charter, magnet schools, public schools into Amherst, this is a different world. And they're trying to navigate this world for the first time, and it's challenging. So I think that segregation piece is something that we really need to be thinking seriously about. And then the other thing I think I would just end on is to say that these are remarkable young adults. The invisible labor that is happening outside of the classroom, so on top of their many hours of reading and writing, they are managing incredibly difficult situations. Many are trying to sponsor their parents for citizenship or residency in the United States. They're dealing with lawyers, as I said, students who are dealing with deportations, evictions, families who are struggling to make ends meet while they are sitting in one of the most elite schools in the world. It's a contradictory situation that can be very emotionally challenging. So, remarkable young adults, there's a lot more to learn. This is early on in the research, but I think I will stop there and just open it up if anyone has questions or comments or discussions. Yes?
I'm kind of triple. First of all, Latina families have a hard time letting their girls go. So I'm surprised there. But also, what is it like for them to go home?
Yeah.
And for their mental adjustment, and also the mental adjustment of their communities at home.
Yeah.
Are they able to go back home?
Great questions, really great questions. The first question is so important. It's something I didn't talk about because I'm just starting to go through this part of the data, but when I was in Montana, part of the reason we didn't look beyond Montana State University for college is because most of the parents said, my daughters will not leave. So another contribution, I think, to this story is you have parents who are willing to let their children go away to pursue opportunities. So very important part of the story, absolutely. Going home, completely disorienting. As you can imagine, the first trip home tends to be exciting and you're seeing your friends, and then students talk about going home and having less to talk about with some of their friends and family members, or seeing the world differently. And I think many of us have had the experience of going to college. You go home, Thanksgiving dinner can be tense, you're thinking differently about the world than, Uncle Bob or whatever, and you don't know if you should say something, but this is a totally different kind of understanding gap. So, very challenging. Also very challenging to go home and say, I want to study sociology. And your dad says, no. Why? You should be studying economics or computer science. What are you going to do with sociology, and what is it anyway? So we talk a lot, we're seeing a lot of this understanding gap, and that plays out at home. And wanting to stay connected and being so committed, but feeling like I'll probably never move back to the Bronx fully. So yeah, great questions. We will just go around. Yes, go ahead.
I'm curious if you've seen differences at different inflection points over the generations. So different people who lived during the end of the guest worker program in the 60s and lived during the Reagan amnesty in the 80s. Was there have you seen differentiations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can answer that a bit because of other research I've done, which has been more with adult migrants. Oh, sure. So this is if there have been generational differences between migrants who came, for example, during the Bracero program, the guest worker program, which ended in the mid-60s, or that got amnesty in 1986. I will say that this is a particularly tough time for immigrant families. The youth who have parents who received amnesty in 1986 are doing much better than the students whose parents were not able to take advantage of that. There also is it's much more challenging to navigate borders than it ever has been because the border is more militarized. So we definitely see that as well. Many of the students who I talk to have never been to their parents' home country. That's not a trip that they could take. And also, it's much more difficult, of course, now for many of their parents to find good low-income, low-skill work. So I would say it's become a more complicated, more challenging story as we've gotten across the generations. Yes?
So I'm really interested about the sibling project that you kind of talked about, because in the framework of the immigrant bargain, what have you seen within those families with different academic achievements that's led one sibling to be so successful and perhaps one sibling to not fulfill that bargain, their kind of bargain?
Yeah. That is a really good question. So a piece I took out of here because I couldn't cover everything is it helps to be a good test taker, to be tracked early on into a support program. And I've had a few students say that they did really well early on their tests, and they had a sibling who didn't. So they would get tracked onto this, high potential college-bound track, and a sibling wouldn't. And so the tracking started early on between siblings. In the sibling project I'm doing, I'm going to have half who have a similar educational trajectory and half who don't, and to try to answer that question more. But what I am seeing is there's a lot of guilt a lot of guilt that's being felt by the sibling who is doing well, the sibling at Amherst. Because the sibling who stays home ends up doing much more of the care work for parents, doing much more of that hands-on work. And that also adds to the pressure of doing well, not just to pull yourself up and your parents, but that sibling. So it's really interesting, but I think just how you do well in school, what kind of intelligence you exhibit, how you perform is often who gets targeted and who doesn't. Another interesting thing that's showing up are gender differences. So someone who, again, back to the question of daughters versus sons, whereas sons may be encouraged to go to prep school via Prep for Prep in New York City, a daughter that's too young to go away, being told that you're going to stay home, would still do well potentially, but maybe not as well as a son. So that's something. But again, pretty early in looking through that, that's why I'm doing the sibling project, because I'm so interested in that. Not that I could speak of right now, but I will say in my Montana research, I found that birth order mattered more than gender often. The oldest child took on more of the work responsibilities, the caretaking responsibilities, and or paved the way for a younger sibling. So if the first child went to college, it was more likely that the second sibling would. Yes? Go ahead.
Could you comment in a general way? It seems like you're talking mostly about getting to Amherst. And I'm curious if you've looked for this cohort at broadly, obviously everybody's different, but if there's any generalizations about how they are doing academically when they get here, what they are doing academically, and the follow-on question, of course, is, how are they doing coming out of Amherst? Right. And I'm curious if there's kind of been a traditional thing here that, the vast majority of graduates go on to some kind of further graduate education. A lot of people, law, medicine, academics. Has that been the case, or have people been more non-traditional or sort of finding different paths?
Great question. It's early in the research, but I will say that everyone I interview, I get permission to contact in 5 and then 10 years. So the idea is, as Buffy Aries did in her research, to actually follow cohorts over time. I will say that many students come in wanting to be medical doctors. And it's something that they're working very hard on in the STEM fields at Amherst, is to help those who may come in with not as much preparation to be able to still have that be a goal. Not many of them leave with medical pre-med or neuroscience or bio degrees. Econ is the next, I think, major of choice. So I end up with many students in my classes who may take 3 or 4 classes with me and not major in sociology, but major in econ, or be doing more computer science or STEM work. So it's having a degree that will lead to some kind of a job after Amherst is important for many of the students. It's important to their parents. But most say they will go to grad school. And that's a very hard sell to their parents. You know, I hear students, their parents will say, "What? More school? More?" And or why? One of the participants I quoted here from LA, she graduated, moved home, is working a great job in a nonprofit in Los Angeles, living at home, and her mom is so frustrated that she can't buy a house yet. And she's applying for a PhD program in the fall. That's been a really tough sell, because again, the payoff then is pushed back. And so these are also issues that students are navigating. Law school is another really, really sought after path past Amherst that students talk about, aspiring to go to law school. And in many cases, they want to be immigration lawyers. I've followed a couple students who were early on in the cohort of interviews. They are in law school now. They're probably going to do pro bono immigration work because they've realized the payoff of doing other kinds of law is much higher. But law school is a big one. I'll just keep going around. Yes?
I just wanted to add something. I've been involved for 17 years in a program in Seattle that was modeled after Prep for Prep called Radio Scholars. And we do everything you say we should do.
Great.
But the other element of our mission, which I think is very important, is to be educated, but to be a leader in your community.
Yeah.
And so our goal is that those and the admissions committee, et cetera, will look different. And we've had incredible success with the kids all going to 4-year colleges and graduating. But the question I have about Amherst, because I'm so aware of how the mentorship and the cohort surrounding and the social incorporation and mobility that is provided by those who are not from their background. I mean, we do a ton of that, of corporations and individuals. And is it happening with alums while the kids are here? Is it happening afterwards? Is it happening with people in the valley that can come and say,
Right.
So I was just curious how that is enriching their experience.
Right. Just in the 4 years I've been here, Amherst has moved forward leaps and bounds in terms of this question. So the Pathways program, I have several students who have taken advantage of that. Do you know the Pathways program where alumni, it's wonderful. And the dedication of the Pathway mentors to some of these students, talking through job interviews late at night, prepping them, helping them think through things, very important. And also, the Loeb Center on campus is doing a remarkable job, because something that I've found in my beginnings of these interviews is how scary it was for students to enter the Loeb Center or to even ask about an internship. What's an internship? And they have students who've come in from upper middle class backgrounds that have already had internships in high school, and they don't even know what it is. So they're, this catch-up game. So the Loeb Center has done a really great job of getting students in the door early, to get them connected with mentors, to get them connected with faculty who are in their area who could help them. So I'm hopeful. I feel like we're getting the importance of that. And also recent grads who are from their same backgrounds who are doing really well have been really incredible. Tony Jack is a great one. I don't know if you know Tony Jack's work, who I mentioned, who's now at Harvard. He's been a really great mentor to many of our students. He's a Wade Fellow now at the college. He comes back and meets with students. And so we're getting there. But yes, so important. So important. Yes?
How significant has been the impact of diversifying the student population in light of what you mentioned is the code switching, and this is from a lifelong code switcher. If Latinos or Middle Easterners or Asians get here and all they want to do is buy boat shoes, and I can understand and feel their pain, especially because power and history overwhelm. How has Project Diversity worked, and how impactful has it been at Amherst?
Yeah, it's challenging. I have to say, when one of the things this project is trying to do is say that assimilation isn't just into a white mainstream, it still kind of is here. I mean, that is the assumption of what you assimilate into is that. The code switching goes that direction. So it's really one of my real commitments as a faculty member here is to try to bridge, to really understand the differentials and the power dynamics that are at work. And to, really the burden is on those of us who haven't had to do any code switching to really think about what that's like. And it's a challenge.
And I think code switching is maybe a necessary evil, but hopefully in the optimum scenario it would work both ways.
Right.
So you can build the bridges,
Right.
not just in one direction.
Absolutely, and that's really, the idea is building those bridges in both directions.
And establishing a common vocabulary, language, perception, vision, but
Right.
again, sort of reciprocal, not
Right.
just
Exactly.
one-sided, because everybody will be assimilating into the same tradition.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Forever.
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's also really exciting to see that commitment, on campus to trying to make that happen. Go here and then
I have
back to
two
you.
short questions.
Yeah.
I notice in traditional families, frequently family role model is important. Someone will say, I'm a family of lawyers or physicians or even plumbers. And I know one family has 4 plumbers.
Right.
And I guess one question I have is how important is that the presence or absence of a role model in the students that you have interviewed in their choice and success of a career? That's number one. And number two is, years ago I took a sociology class, and the professor said that one of the things that helped immigrant ethnic families succeed was what he called ethnocentricity, kind of a feeling that we're important, we have value as a group, and that kind of propelled them on.
Right.
And it sounds like with your students, that's not kind of there. There's more of kind of a hostile feeling towards the immigration population. So those are the two questions,
Right.
family role models, the absence of presence, and this feeling, can they get a sense of, we're important as a group to help propel them forward?
Right. I think the role model question is a tough one because everyone in this study is a first-generation college student, so there isn't a role model in terms of someone they look up to professionally. They usually want to be something that no one they know has ever done. Yet they do see their family, their parents as role models in terms of their work ethic, their values, their commitment. So they'll talk, they still hold their parents in very high esteem. And so the role model just, I think, looks different. But the mentors become very important role models in terms of knowing someone who cares about you that you want to be like. I think faculty members become really important role models for students as well. And it's an important reason why we are trying to diversify our faculty too, so students can have more faculty members who share their backgrounds. So that's an important thing. And the other thing I think that Amherst is doing a really good job of is getting that ethnic community and pride, despite the anti-immigrant sentiment. And Biddy's been very clear in her support of our immigrant students. Our admissions policy alone shows that, that support. So, I think students can often have a bipolar experience here. They can feel like they never quite belong, and yet they meet friends and community that they say is the most important they've ever had in their life. So I don't know if that's a clear answer, but it's complicated. You're welcome.
Appreciate that very much.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I think your research is fascinating, by the way.
Thank you.
It's been a great presentation. As I was listening to you, it began to strike me that almost everything that you were saying about different ethnically defined or racially defined subgroups of the Amherst College population could have equally have been said about distinctions regardless of those identifiers based purely on economic background. In other words, you could have been talking about, and had you been talking about white families exclusively somewhere in Kentucky, with very, very high poverty rates, and about children there who, if they could come to a school like this, would definitely be the first in their families, the first generation to even consider going to a school like this. Or anywhere else, in America, and unfortunately, but not what I just described, using the cliche of Appalachia, that now describes many more vast areas of the United States. And it just struck me, not everything, of course, not all the distinctions you talked about, and all the challenges you talked about, and all the remedies that you were proposing or suggesting, but almost all were really about differences in socioeconomic background, regardless of race, ethnicity, immigrant status, citizenship status. And if that is the case, it's very important because it counsels in favor of a whole different set of programs and public policies than the ones that one would come up with, that a government agency, for example, would come up with, if you really thought that the problem was specific to people with a Latino background or something. And that also is important because the broader, it seems to me, the political prospects for political success of programs to ameliorate some of the problems and disadvantages that you're describing are vastly different and probably much higher if what you're talking about are programs directed to poor people generally in the United States. For example, Medicaid versus programs that are targeting specific immigrant groups, ethnic groups, religious groups, or racial groups.
No, I think many of the findings that I reported on here have to do primarily about socioeconomic class, but not all. And I think in this immigration moment, the legal status one becomes a really important one, for example. So having mobility programs that target individuals means often that family members get left behind. Now, it's one thing if you get left behind but you're a U.S. citizen. It's another thing if you get left behind and you can be deported. So clearly, but I do think that's an important piece. It's also an important reason why I am able to talk about this. I can talk about feeling like an imposter at Amherst College and not have an immigrant background. I have a research assistant who is a low-income student from Utah, and she gets it in so many ways. You know, there are different ways that people can feel marginalized or not like they belong. So I would say, yes, we need to be thinking about inequality in general and socioeconomic class, but there is an important immigration piece at work. And if Alali would have been here, she would have spoken specifically to that. A lot of my data does speak to that. I didn't cover it necessarily. But, you know, we have quite a few students at Amherst who will lose their DACA status soon. And one of my students who will graduate with pre-med and doesn't know if she'll be able to stay in the United States. So there's a different kind of emotional weight that immigrant students are carrying in this specific era. And we, you know, can protect them so much at Amherst, but really not totally. So that's the piece I think that I'm also trying to hone in on. And the family piece, because in immigrant families, there tend to be more stratifications. We find in the research than in other low-income families that have to do with legal status, but have to do also with the ways that, you know, who was born in the U.S., who wasn't, and what kinds of opportunities come out of that. But absolutely, there are similarities, important ones. Maybe we'll do we have time? No time? Okay, one more question. Yes, go ahead.
How do the students speak about the receptivity, their sense of the receptivity of the classmates around them when they come here? I mean, these are brave young people.
Yeah.
Just, it's a
Yeah.
frightening thought.
Yeah, I think I've heard various responses. I think most students would say they feel like they're received well, but I also would say most of my students graduate, and I ask them who their best friends are, and they're students who come from the same backgrounds as they do. So there's still segregation on this campus. We're such a diverse community, but I will tell you, white men don't take my classes. They just don't. I'm like, take my class, and I'll have one, And white women, yes, but we still tend to be segregated in our classrooms and where people sit in Val, and we're working on it. And students are committed, but it's both ways. I mean, it's the bridging. It's that dynamics going both ways. But it's a challenge, and it's not just a challenge at Amherst. I mean, Biddy at the last faculty meeting said we have opened up this college to what's going on in the world, and that's a good thing. It's easy to just say we're just going to stay this bubble. We're not, but it also means we have challenges, definite challenges in front of us that we're working on. Last question, sure.
The last point about I think you made or was made about how students sit, what their network of friends are. It was the same 50 years ago. There were students that I never knew because they were in pre-med, most of them.
Yeah.
So the notion of why have you come? What is the goal that you have in college? It can vary within groups. And Amherst was very professionally oriented.
Right.
Then.
Right.
So that could work against, in a sense, the kind of integration, not intentionally, but it could work against it.
Right.
And sociological integration of students.
Absolutely. And I see a space for having close networks with people who you're close to, that who share your backgrounds. I think that's so important. And yet I'd also like to see both. Where we can have our places where we feel at home and in our communities, and also be building bridges. Because I feel like, I don't want to sound preachy, but I feel like if we can't do it at Amherst, what happens outside of Amherst, where we're leaps and bounds ahead of the rest of the country, but we see the silos. And so, so I'd like, I think it is important that we work on the bridging here, and we definitely are. We're also trying to honor, those who, being with the people who you share background with, and that's important too. Great. Thank you very much.